Good evening, everybody. There's only two things to mention before I introduce George. One is that for those of you who haven't been reading your emails, the AGM was a couple of weeks ago, and unfortunately, all the same people are back in their same old positions. And one other thing is that QIM has invited us to go to their Warbirds weekend, which is on Saturday the 26th and Sunday the 27th. Is it on both days or is it one? Saturday. It's just Saturday. On the 26th of April, straight after Anzac Day. And so we need a couple of people, 6 altogether actually, so that we can do some shifts so that people are not standing behind a hot desk all day. So if any of you would like to come up there, you get free entry and lunch. You've only got to do about 2 hours on the desk. The rest of the time's yours. If you can give Warwick, myself, or Peter a call, an email to say that you're interested. So that's all I've got to say in housekeeping. So I'd like to introduce George, an ex-president of this organisation.
We didn't have membership like this when I was running it.
Oh, well, we don't normally have this many people here either. It's fantastic. We thought we did very well just recently. I think it was the last meeting we had. We had quite a good sized meeting. How many of you counted for tonight? 34. Pretty good. Pretty good. Well, so George, as I said, ex-president, but also airline pilot and a number of other things that will become obvious as he talks to you. So I'll hand over to George. Thanks, Bob.
You guys can hear me at the back? Apparently I'm alive, which is good at my age to be told that. You may or may not know that I wrote a book, and what caused this, when I first retired from Singapore Airlines, I went to a school. I thought I might renew my instructor rating and do a little bit of GA instructing. It was never my intention to take work off all the young desperates. I just wanted something to do. I tried golf, and the last time I hit a golf ball, I hit a tree branch and ended up behind me, so that was the end of the golf. I could see no point in pursuing that. And they had a poster on the counter. There was nobody at their desk, and there was a little girl with a ponytail with 4 gold bars, and behind her was an A380, and it said, "Ask us how you can be a professional pilot in 12 months." Well, it just made smoke come out of my ears, and I went home, and my wife said, "Well, why don't you write a book about the real journey and how tough it is for the young people, especially now, the young guys coming through with the cost of fuel and things. It's a tough gig." And so I did. It went to a publisher. It had to go through a legal thing where they said, "Is this person still alive?" And I said, "Yes." It said, "You can't say that. You've got to pull that out." And then I had a lady go through it. I wasn't allowed to say girls were beautiful anymore. I had to cross out the word beautiful. So it went through a couple of layers. So the original title was Towards a Left Seat, describing what the journey is to become an airline captain, which is the left seat, obviously. And they didn't like that. They said it doesn't appeal to the layperson. So they changed it to pilot with my name, big letters. I don't want to end up like a certain gentleman of QF32. So I wasn't that keen on the new title. But anyway, surprise, surprise, the book is selling. It's now in print in Germany and Japan. And why anybody in Japan would want to know about my flying career is anybody's guess. But the interesting thing is it's not selling to the young people I directed it to, it's selling to lay people. Or you can buy it off the line, off the internet. There's about 14 different sources where you can get it. Barnes & Noble have just taken it up. It looks like it'll pay for itself, but I won't make any money out of it. But on your flyer, you've got all the things that I'll be discussing. That is just a complete copy of the back of the book. I won't have time. I had originally 250 slides, and Bob and everybody else said, you can't do that. There's too many. So I've taken 110 off.
You still got too many.
And they still say it's too many. So I'm not going to be able to discuss some of the subjects that's on the flyer. We'll just quickly go through my career. And the point I want to make is that it's not 12 months. You can get a commercial license in 12 months. We've got a young guy here who's just got his commercial. Congratulations to you, mate. Now the hard bit. And it took me 3 or 4 years of training to get the basic commercial license. Then there was 7 years in GA because the airlines didn't recruit for a long time. I think Qantas at one stage, they didn't recruit for 8 years. So, you know, you could have been Chuck Yeager's and you still wouldn't get in. I had interviews with TAA and Ansett, and they both said, if you come back with heavy time or turbine time, we'll give you a second interview. So it was a struggle. And I finally got into the airline system at 29. And then you sit in the right-hand seat for 10 years. So it took me 18 years before I was a captain on a domestic jet. And then once you get there, off you go, as Warwick's done and a few others. Ray's here somewhere. Where's Ray? Ray's done. Ray was with the opposition. You were TAA, Ray, weren't you? Are you a TAA? So yeah, it's a long, hard journey. And that's all I wanted to do in this book was if you're not dedicated, if you're not really hungry for it, you won't get it. And some of the figures I've been researching are quite frightening. The worst year I found was 2009. Only 29% of the commercial pilots issued in 2009 are still in the industry. Now, those are terrible figures. And what frightens me, I'm running into young people now with HECS debts of 150, 160,000, and they're unemployable. They've got diamond, GA 40 time, and we're putting them in 210s out at Redcliffe and taking them up to Dunwich on the dirt strip there amongst the flies and the kangaroos and just trying to roughen them up a bit so they can get a job. I want to get the message across that this is a hard, tough industry and you've got to be dedicated. And if you've got sons, daughters that want to fly, this is the best message they could ever get. I took that photo. I was racing British Airways and the bastard beat me. That was across... I met him in Changi at flight planning and we had a bit of a beer bet. I don't know what he did with his airplane, but I couldn't get near him. But that's as close as I'd get to him. 747. Yeah. That's a 747. That's BA and we were SQ9. My career started off a bit like the birth of the Luftwaffe. At 13, I was in the Air Training Corps. I'm a Brit by birth. I don't feel English. I never lived in England. My dad was an Air Force pilot. He then became an air traffic controller. And I grew up in Yemen in Komosika in the Middle East, then Gütersloh in Germany, and then Changi and Tenga with postings in Singapore. They then came out under the 10-pound POM scheme in 1964. I was 15 and swore allegiance to the Queen at some stage, and I'm now an Australian. But I never felt like a POM. I've never lived there. But anyway, briefly, I was in the Air Cadets in Cornwall for about 6 months. And I did some gliding as a 13-year-old. And that's my gliding logbook. And you can see that hours are not particularly high. Wouldn't get into TAA on that. And that's me far left. Oh, I've got a doodad here, haven't I? That's me there looking terrified. We went and did circuits and bumps in a Hastings. And by now, the desire to fly is just, you know, I'm past the point of return. This is the British Air Training Corps. And the interesting one is this. That still exists in the Newark Air Museum. And I went there and I said to one of the docents, I used to fly in this as a cadet. And they just looked at me and thought, well, we got plenty of dreamers around here. I don't think they believed me, but I did. As a 14-year-old, I did 2 5-hour trips in that. You can see it here somewhere. Well, there's a 2-hour one. And I still remember the captain's name. It was Flight Lieutenant Fielding. And I've often wondered whatever happened to him, but we were flying over Russian trawlers that were spying on the military. When we came to Australia, I was 15. You can't learn to fly until 16, so I had to bite the bullet for 6 or 7 months. When I turned 16, I went to the Aero Club of South Australia and I started learning to fly. But it was very expensive. That was my first aeroplane I ever flew, was BWH, which subsequently got destroyed in a fatal accident. Now you'll love this, £5, 3 shillings and sixpence. And the bottom one is my restricted private pilot's license test. And it cost me $21. I bought a sandwich in a coffee shop yesterday and a sandwich and a cappuccino and my wife a black tea, $30. $10 more than my PPL flight test. That's another picture of the Aero Club Victors. They were the 100. They were a little underpowered. I later flew a 160 in my later years and they were a totally different airplane. Now that's me as a private pilot. I don't know why I'm frowning. And then I went to that NASA school in Cessnock and some interesting people here. This is me here. That's Brian McCarthy, Barry Sue. These guys, Fred Joyner never went commercial. Nick ended up as a captain with Philippine Airlines, a 747 captain. Never made it, never made it, never made it. Andy became a crop duster. I don't know what happened to him. He became a station pilot in the Northern Territory on a cattle station. Noddy, as we called him, went into real estate. Jeff Dale ended up in Ansett, and I ended up in Ansett. Brian ended up in TAA. So only Brian and I actually got into the domestic airline system out of that course. So it's a pretty tough industry. It eats its own young, and I don't know how we can do anything to change it. And that's what I'm trying to do now, is to, with this book, at least tell people what the journey's like. I ran out of money there, and then I had national service. I went to the Air Force because I didn't want to join. Where's Bob? I didn't want to join Bob walking through mangrove swamps in Vietnam. So I joined the Air Force and I got rejected on the first day of 3 days of testing. So I didn't get very far. To escape the army, I went into the Air Force and I did a course at the School of Radio as a wireless telegraphist. And I got selected for cryptographic training, which is basically an Enigma machine on a computer. Up until a few years ago, I wasn't allowed to talk about it because I had to sign a 50-year secret thing. So God knows what they're doing now. But we were monitoring a lot of Russian shipping and stuff like that. So it was quite interesting work. And I used to work at night and fly during the day. And I ended up getting a job with 3DB. You can see 3DB written under the wing here, doing the early morning radio traffic. So I'd be working all night in the decoding room, decoding all these messages, and just to be real, a lot of them were send more toilet rolls. They weren't all James Bond notes. There were some, but most of them were just short of toilet rolls or something. And the RAF News printed an article about an Air Force guy being the 3DB pilot for the morning traffic. It's all done by helicopter now, but back in 71, it was all done by Cessna. And I got called into Squadron Leader Cowburn's office and he wanted to know what the hell is going on and why haven't you applied for aircrew? And I said, I have, and I got rejected. He said, well, you've got a commercial license now, go and apply again. Because of my radio school background, they offered me air electronics. Sitting in the back of an Orion was not a pilot. So he said, why don't you apply for a discharge? And I did under section 118. And in those days, to get out under a section like that, you had to be stark raving bonkers, or wanting to be a GA pilot. So that's me flying the GA 3DB. I then, with Bill Sir, who was the owner of the company, I flew these Fletchers briefly. They were agricultural airplanes, but we put 244 drums in the back and we used them for mutton birds down on the islands. I then did an instructor rating and I did some instructing on the Chipmunk RSK. Where's Ray? That's similar to your colour.
That's one of the fortunes. I learned to fly later under British Airways.
Yeah, I nearly was killed. I was nearly killed in that airplane with Kevin Duffy, who was a big guy, about 3 times my size. And before we had the spin strakes on the back, it just had the tailplane going in, and we got into a he was so much bigger than me. We got into a flat spin, the prop stopped, and the nose was just cutting through the horizon like this, and we just couldn't get it out. And he ended up taking his harness off and leaning forward and rocking the flaps up and down. And with some turbulence, as we're down about 3,000 feet was our floor, and we recovered at 1,500 feet. So that was the first time my life nearly ended, was in the front of that. He was testing me to teach spinning. I'm in the front, he's in the back, and he was too big. That was one airplane, I have to confess, I never mastered. I couldn't land that thing to save myself. That's a J5F with the short metal wings. It was fully aerobatic. Heel brakes instead of toe brakes. The flaps up in the roof when you pulled forward and out, or out and forward. And the only way to land that with any sense of dignity was to have it completely stalled in the 3-point attitude and the wings dead, and it just went plop onto the ground. I went to the Great Tiger Moth Air Race with the owner, Tony James. He only had a restricted license at the time, so I went with him just to make it all legal. I flew that for a little while down amongst the Bass Strait Islands, just doing mutton birds again. And then I got a job at Mount Isa with Lanham's Air Charter. This is 1974. And this was just flying Cessnas around the cattle stations. That's one of them there. It's probably still out there. I'm flying one older than that at the moment. And that's the 207, which was a dog of an airplane. And we had a belly pack underneath it as well, when you could put 120 pounds in the belly, I think. That's an ex-civil Bonanza that we had up there, which we used for the more executive type charters. And that was mainly flying the station managers and people like that around. And that's typical scenery. That's just north of Mount Isa. This is one of the station strips. I can't remember which ones they are now. All dirt strips. Some of them are sealed now. And we used to stay for lunch. If we arrived at lunchtime, that station would take us in and we'd sit at the table, say grace, stuff like that. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I kept in touch with the owners of Iffley Station until about 2005, regular Christmas cards and whatnot. Then I was married at that stage, and I married the receptionist at CASA's office at Moorabbin Airport. It's one of those young pilot impulse things. And she ended up running off with an air traffic controller. Sorry, Bob. But and what makes it worse, he was a surface movement controller, 1217. It wasn't even a tower controller. But anyway. And that is another, for our young commercial pilot here, there's a lot of pressures on you as a junior pilot. If you get married, dragging your wife up to somewhere like Mount Isa, the accommodation was awful. We had a lilo floor with grass growing through it. It was pretty tough on my first wife, and she missed her family. I then went to civil flying school, and I tried to save up for an instrument rating, and I eventually started my instrument rating in CON. That's taken at Parafield, actually. CON, Oscar Nuts, we used to call it, is a very popular airplane. Just about everybody I know who did an instrument rating did it on CON. So, well, in Melbourne. I flew this very early 310 for Bill Sir. I last saw that when I was flying a Fokker Friendship with Ansett at Hamilton in Victoria, but it was derelict on the side of the strip. Quite a different beast to the later aeroplanes. That belonged to Dr. Ward, a friend of Bill Sir, and I flew that for a while. We called that Death and Disaster. It was a peculiar aeroplane. It only has a pump on one engine, and I can't remember which one it is now, but you actually didn't raise the gear if you lost an engine on takeoff. There was a lot of drag when the doors opened. So if you lost an engine, you didn't raise the gear. But we used that for a bit of prawn spotting, and we shut the rear engine down and just fly around on the front engine. I then got my first real twin job for a company called Hog Industries, and I left civil as an instructor to go and fly for them. But it only went for about 4 months. We kept having unscheduled maintenance. They sold the airplane new to the company, and they were taking advantage of a decentralized industry down in Bairnsdale, where there was tax relief if you took your industry out of the major city areas. And they sold the airplane with so many dollars per hour, and I blew 2 of those nylon suction pumps in the first day or two. And gradually the accountant just couldn't take the pressure, and they just got rid of it. but it got me 300 hours, which I desperately needed on twins. I then went to Australian Air Charters. They wanted 500 hours on twins. Of course, I didn't have it, but I thought, what have I got to lose? I went in there, and Graham Lowe, the boss, said, no, you haven't got, we can't meet the insurance requirements. And I walked away. And his wife, Betty, said, you miserable bastard, give him a go. Can't you take out a cover note for him? And they did. They called me back, gave me a go, took out a cover note, but I had to fly the Twin Comanche until I had 500 hours, twin. And then they put me on the Aztec, the Navajo, Chieftain, and the night freight work. You can see the canvas sheeting up there. And these are early Navajos with two-bladed props. They're not like the things you got now with potties and bars and dividers and heavy-duty brakes and air conditioning. The air conditioning alone is like a person sitting out on the wing. It's 120 pound, I think, or it might even be kilos. I can't remember. But these early Navajos, we didn't have co-pilot instruments in them. They were freighters. And we took 800 kilos in that, which a lot of people don't believe me now. They say, you can't get that in a Navajo. And the Navajo I flew yesterday can only take 600 kilos because it's got all the other bizzo and windscreen wipers and whatnot. So we took the newspapers to Canberra every night. We flew government ministers around, including the Premier Dick Hamer and his wife April. And we serviced the Gabo Lighthouse every Thursday. We went to the lighthouse. We took a Navajo in there. It's only 1,800 feet grass. It was okay for landing because the Navajo's got good brakes. If the grass was wet, we wouldn't go in there. We'd take the Aztec in there. But the Navajo, you'd get airborne if you were heading out. Normally we took off this way, heading out to the west. That's east over here, obviously. And we'd get airborne about here. So if you lost an engine, you were just going to go for a swim. And, you know, being young and fearless, we accepted all that. But right now, I'd say you've got to be mad. But that's the power of youth. That's proof that we went to Gabo. It's a very poor photo, but a lot of people don't believe that we took Navajos in there. But we're always coming out empty. The lighthouse is gone now. It's an automatic station. Now, I came back from Moomba, and one of the flipper doors jammed on a broken hinge with the broken hinge on the outside of the door. So even pumping the gear, I couldn't get the gear down. So we spoke to the engineers and we decided that we'll do a gear up landing on the grass strip, which no longer exists. There's a factory building there now. This is at Moorabbin. Thinking I would save at least one propeller, I feathered the right engine, and with the starter, I just kept tapping it until I got the blades horizontal. But I wasn't game to do it on this one. I wanted a bit of power. I landed with the flaps up, the cowl flaps closed, and without blowing my own bags, I did very little damage. But the chief engineer, Peter Lang, was very, very religious. He never swore. And when he ran up to the airplane, he kept saying, shit. And I thought, well, this is not my Peter, you know, the man of the cloth. This propeller here had about 2 hours left on it. This one was brand new. I got it round the wrong way, but I wasn't to know. I don't go around reading log books. Anyway, at this stage, you can see I'm 26. That's the newspaper article. I've got 2 years to run before the airlines will reject. So I'm getting desperate. TAA said, if you get turbine time, heavy time, we will give you another interview. Ant said something similar in a letter. Qantas just said, we wish you all the best in your aviation career, which is a very unique Qantas way of saying bugger off. So I wanted to get out of this and get into heavy time. That's MBK, which sadly killed my best friend at the time. It's all in the book. That's how it ended up. They had a hole in the piston on the number 2 cylinder on the right engine, pressurized the oil in the crankcase. The pressurized oil blew the oil filler dipstick out, and the turbochargers on the Chieftain at high power glow white hot, and the flames were coming out of the grill. Peter said he had a fire when he really only had a piston out. He could have got around if he kept the engine going, but seeing the fire, you could see it from the ground, he decided to shut the engine down, and he had 900 kilos of newspapers and didn't have the performance to get around. The light twins are not required like the 4 segments you get in the heavy jet world. Now, that was very sad. That's the one we used to fly the Victorian Premier around, Dick Hamer. I can't remember the year now. I think it was 75 or 75, I think. Air Express lost a Bristol freighter in the Bass Strait. They lost an engine. And these cows on the Bristol open up like giant, like a frill-neck lizard. They're the petal cows, like a Viscount cows. It was a sleeve valve engine, 1980 brake horsepower. And it blew a sleeve, popped the cows open. And again, a lot of drag. And they didn't make it. They went in the water 17 miles south of Wonthaggi VOR. They used to fly them single pilot with a radio operator. Now, the end result of CASA's investigation was that any airplane above 5,700 kilos must be crewed by 2 pilots. So they advertised for first officers when they grounded the whole fleet. And they were merging with Brain and Brown, who had DC-3s and an Argosy at the time. And I was the first of the new co-pilots to be put on. And Derek Scott said to me, "You're the number one so far. You can have the Bristol or the DC-3. And I said, "What does the DC-3 weigh?" And he said, 26,000 pounds. And I said, "What does the Bristol weigh?" And he said, 44,000 pounds. So that's one of the worst mistakes I've ever made in my life. I said, "I'll take the Bristol," because it was bigger and heavier, you see. And I had this beam of bonnet about heavy time. So I knocked back a DC-3. And when you think I've flown the 7.2 and the 7.4, wouldn't a DC-3 be nice? And of course, when I went to Singapore Airlines and they saw B170 on my license, they said, "What kind of Boeing is that?" And of course, I laughed. And I found it a very difficult endorsement. It was difficult to taxi. It had bag brakes. There's a 21 and a 31. That's a 31. Here's one of the 21s here. You can see it doesn't have the dorsal fillet. It had the slightly smaller engines. And it had the British handbrake up on the control column. You had to move the rudder pedal across first and then stab this bicycle type lever. And there was a lot of lag in it. When my first time to taxi, the captain said to me, "Right, young George, off you go." And because we taxi in and taxi out, not like the jets where they've only got a tiller on the left side. And I was just doing these giant S turns. And he says, "We can see well enough over the nose. It's not necessary to do the S turns in this airplane." And he thought I was doing it on purpose. I was basically out of control. And similar on my first few takeoffs, it had an electrical tail wheel lock, which only the Brits would do, with a 5-minute limit on it. You threw a switch, a red light came on, you had to be running straight, and then a solenoid dropped a pin in 2 holes. We went to Tullamarine one day to pick up a Jindervik target, which we were going to take to Nowra, and we had to stop on the taxiway. It was roaring northerly wind. We just landed on 3-4. And we on the, I can't remember the taxi, it might have been Juliet. We came off Juliet. But as we're turning around, I said to the captain, "We're coming up for 5 minutes." And he says, "Well, tell ATC we've just got to stop." So we told ATC we were stopping, and they said, "Confirm operations normal." We said, "Yes." And there was a pregnant pause, I think is the word. And so I popped up and said, "We're just cooling the tail wheel." And I don't think he believed us, but we were. After a minute, you could put the lock back in and you've got another 5 minutes of taxiing. What damaged my hearing was this airplane. My right ear is down 33 decibels and you're allowed 35. So on my last medical, they said you're 1 rock concert away from a problem. Well, it was this airplane. We carried 4 ton more than the DC-3. We had an autopilot, and that's this thing here. I don't expect you to believe me, but it was pneumatic. This lever here, which looks like an undercarriage lever, see off and on? That's the autopilot on and off switch. First of all, you had to, with these little knobs here, center everything. You had to be flying dead level, dead straight. Then you centered all these little indices that you can just see one indice there. When they're all center, you put the lever in, and it was actually quite a good autopilot. We forgot to turn it off once, and we're taxiing in, and I'm thinking, this bloody thing's hard to taxi. We must have a flat tire. So yeah, it was a funny system because it was all tied in with the pneumatics. But I learned to use my feet on this airplane. I had quite a bit of tail wheel time, but this airplane really taught me how to use my feet. I then went to Conair. The airlines weren't recruiting. I'm 28 at this stage, so I'm on the cutoff. Conair at the time had an RPT license, regular public transport. They were operating herons on RPT licenses. So the word on the street was someone's going to buy them out. Get your ass up there and you can get into the airlines through the back door. So I went up there and they put me on the Navajo because I had Navajo time. So I was flying out to Narbalak. I had colour in my hair then. My wife was talking about my white hair the other day, and that little girl next door said, "Don't worry, Mr. Palmer, you look very extinguished." But I'm not dying it. That's landing at the Narbalak mine, which is now closed. And we actually flew 44 drums of yellow cake out of there as well. So I don't seem to be having any effect. These are some of the miners there. Now, I don't profess to be huge, but I don't think I'm a midget either. But look at the size of these dudes. And they were all like that out there. And every second person was called Smith. They're all hiding from wives and taxman. Interesting part of the world. Then I went on the heron. You can no longer take that picture. This here is now sacred. That they call that the skull. You're no longer allowed to take a picture of that at Ayers Rock. And the strip has all been closed. And tourists are only allowed around the other side, and you're not allowed to climb the rock anymore. So that's actually not my picture, to be fair. It's off the internet, but that's something you'll never see again. The herons had the same engine as the Navajo, the IO 540, but they took the turbocharger off. So they went from 310 to 290 horsepower, but they're an IO 540. The funny thing with the heron, if you got short of fuel and range, you shut an engine down, you can stay up longer and go further. Yeah, it's one of the properties of the... There was a funny incident here. We went into town. This is at Manangrita. That's the international terminal at Manangrita. We went into town. Carl, the German refueler there, was very famous. He went native and married one of the Aboriginal girls and never wore shoes and only wore a pair of black shorts. And he said, "Would you like to come in Sultan?" So we did, but we didn't put the gus lock on, which was my fault. It's off here when we took the photo. And you don't get much wind in the tropics, but there was enough wind to just wave the rudder backwards and forwards, and it bled the brakes off. And there's a bit of a slope on the tarmac there. When we came up the road, which is up here, I said to my partner in crime, "Somebody's nicked the airplane, it's gone." It actually rolled back over here somewhere, but it was all right. It didn't go anywhere. There's another lesson for the young pilot back here. Secure your airplane. And the flaps on that, very British, all fabric, of course, and 60 degrees. And you used to come down like a Stuka, you know, when you're coming into land. If you forget to flare in a heron, you'll end your days. We had to synchronize the propellers electrically with 4 switches, which are just outside the photo. They're just up there. And the poor old co-pilot just spent any picture attitude change, the props are out of sync. So you just had to keep flicking these switches until the blue light stopped flashing, and then the props are back in sync again. We carried 16 people in it. Then I went on the Nomad, and we had 2 Nomads. We had the Search Master with the B radar, and we had the Lytton radar, which is in a chin. That's the Nomad cockpit. And there's the Lytton radar, 360-degree radar. We had a radar operator sitting in a closed, curtained-off area back here. This is a bubble window, and we had an observer there. We had VLF Amiga, and in those days, we weren't looking for illegal migrants. We were chasing drug. Remember that Tate guy that the Force landed an air commander? That was all.
He lived behind me in Townsville.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they got him. But I volunteered for what they called the Ocean, which was this airplane with the Lytton radar, and we went out 200 miles and chased down anybody in illegal yachts and druggies and whatnot. It was quite entertaining, actually. I enjoyed it. The Nomad's not as bad. We had the usual problems. In the pontoon here, there's actually undercarriage doors. If you can believe it, they go up and inside. And they used to flick mud up in there and get caught in the micro switch. So we actually took the doors off. So this is the flipper door, which drops down. The gear retracts forward. And then the 2 doors that are up inside here drop down and close. It was quite an unusual. The other problem we had on the other side where the double doors are, I don't know if if I've got one on the other side, there's the double door right there with a skinny George. Look at that, no tummy there. The flaps are in the door arc. So there was a micro switch up here that if the door was open, you couldn't get the flaps down. And what happened is water used to run across the top of the wing in heavy tropical rain, short out the micro switch, and suddenly you can't get the flaps out because the micro switch is gone. The other problem we had was icing, and these are cowls that not modified. They put a groove down the side of the cowl here, and that fixed the icing problem. It used to ice up around the intake. The Allison 450 17B, I think it is, or 420 17B, the Allison engine is a Jet Ranger engine. I just flew that one from Avalon, the factory. Took me 12 hours, not all in one hit. We stayed in Alice Springs. That's the engineer that came up with me. But that was a brand new airplane being delivered. Anyway, guess what? Ansett took over Conair. So that worked, and off we went to Ansett. And there's a one stripe FO, which is a status something lower than a dead cockroach. I ended up flying for all the subsidiaries. I ended up doing my initial training with Airlines in New South Wales there with a very colourful captain that was the last of the Ansett flying boat captains still in service, Ken Gemelli. They retired in Redland Bay because that's where they used to have the alternate strip there. He had all these maritime terminologies, you know, the poop deck and all this avast there, and he was very, very sailor. But very interesting. I flew for Airlines of Northern Territory as an FO. Here's me with my one stripe, the captain's Mal Cox, and this young English lass is a refueler at Ayers Rock. And this is before everybody became precious. We used to hold up Playboy pictures up here as we taxied in because she used to marshal us into the fuel bowser. And she was a terrific sport, but her visa ran out and she had to go back to England. I then went to Airlines in South Australia. Now, who was I talking to before? Starting to get a bit cocky, you see. I've got two stripes and the hat on the veteran angle. That didn't last when I got into the air. That's the Fokker Friendship cockpit. Very busy airplane, I always thought, compared to the Nomad, which just had two condition levers. This thing had a very big propeller and an out of control propeller, as Ray and anyone else in the room that's flown these things will tell you, will literally tear the airplane apart. So they had all these locks. They had the high pitch lock, 32 degrees by memory, the low pitch lock, 18 degrees, I think it was, and a system of lights to tell you where the prop was. And it was quite a complicated airplane. You had fuel trimmers down on the console here where you could trim the power up, and you had to adjust the power for atmospheric conditions every day. The engines were tested in a cell and they had minimum dry and wet. We had water meth tank in the back of the airplane. I can't remember the quantity of it. It sat in the back there. We had one leaking and I was cupping it in my hands and I said, yeah, that's not water, that's water meth. And one of the engineers said, you idiot, that's bloody carcinogenic, that stuff. Don't touch it. You know. I don't tell pilots things like that. That's the final colour scheme, and that's the one I got checked to the line on, and that's currently up in the Queensland Air Museum. Then I went on to the 7.3, the 200 with the JD8-18 engines. That's at Canberra. So that's me again, looking a bit suntanned there, Georgie boy. That's at Hobart. And that's the old analogue cockpit. And when you look at that now, you think, how the hell do they fly sits and stars with all that gear? But we got around okay. We had something which I only saw once in my jet career, electronic checklist down here. Even on the Jumbo, we didn't have that. That's a PDCS, a performance data computer system. Did you fly with those? And this is the Amiga navigation system, which was not as accurate as a GPS. And of course, all the round dials. Then I got offered a secondment to Western Samoa because I had Nomad time. And I went there. I'd been divorced at that stage and I'd met Melissa, my current wife, and I was getting cold feet. I thought, I'm not going down this rabbit hole again. So they said, would you like to go to Polynesia for 6 months? So I said yes. When I came back, we got married. So I flew this Nomad. I also flew the Islander. I'd never flown an Islander before. And they said, do you want to fly the Islander? They're very casual over there. I said, I'd love to. So I flew the Islander as well. And in the book, there's an article there where I mentioned that very rarely it didn't have cloud on it. That's on Savai'i Island. And the day it didn't have cloud on it, I tried to get in have a look around inside in the island. I was empty. There was no passengers. And I was VFR. And I've never had turbulence like it. I literally got thrown out the other side. It's an article in the book. That was my hut in Samoa. I blew a tire on the coral reef there at Pango, that is. And that's the engineer at Fungali. We used to take the island to a place called Asau, and it was a terrible place. It's been covered in lava now. It doesn't exist. The volcano went off and buried it. And when we used to cancel SAR, we used to say, arsehole circuit area cancel SAR. And the guy on the other said, oh, SAR, I got it. He didn't, he just thought it was our Australian accents. Back on the 7-3, and then sadly we had the pilots dispute. We've got people here that are on both sides, and I'm not going there. I came back and they offered me a command on the 727. You notice we've got a wombat on the nose. We used to call the night freighters the Wombat Squadron, and Sir Peter Abel's. It's a bit crude with ladies present, but I'm sure you won't be offended. It's because wombats come out at night. Eats roots and leaves. So Abel thought that was very funny, so he allowed us to keep it. I don't think Murdoch was quite in favour, but we kept it. It's one of the engineers. You could get into the trunk on the S bend in the 7-2. Beautiful airplane to fly. Did you fly the 7-2, Ray? Yeah. Could be hard to land, especially the LR. They beefed it up where the straight 200 was 86 something thousand kilos, where the LR was 89,000 kilos, or 89 tons. Beefed up stub wings, slightly different gear doors. But it still had the JD8-15 engines, where it would have been better off having the -17 engines. It was a little bit underpowered at 89 ton, taking off at Alice Springs at 40 degrees. I took off once on 1-2 to go to Darwin, and as I'm turning the 180, climbing back up, there was a big cloud of dust off the end of the strip. And I said to the air traffic controller that it was a friend of mine, actually, Andy Hedger. We used to call him Hedgehog. I said, Andy, did I do that? And he said, you certainly did. He says, we're about to hit the crash button. Well, at a full weight, this airplane would just get airborne, but it just would hesitate in the climb. And it was airborne, but it would just drag its bottom through the scrub a little. And it was just enough to raise the dust. That's the captain's very basic panel when you look at it. That's a VLF navigation aid there. The engineer's panel looks more complicated than it actually is, because everything's in threes. These are all electrical. This is all fuel, hydraulics. The captain had to know that off by heart. Ansett were quite tough in the simulators. There was more checking than there was training. The airlines now have finally got their act together, and it's more training than checking. And what, you know, surprise, surprise, they're getting better results from it. We had to tune the generators in on the 7-2 with flashing lights. The overhead panel, the captain on the top left has got all the hydraulics to the flight controls. The FO has got all the window heat and whatnot. HF radios used to be all over the place in the 7-2. That's me as a 727 captain. Just a hint of grey hair coming. That's the command pressures for you. Then I got offered an opportunity to fly the Southern Cross replica. And for the record, my mother-in-law paid for it, because they were looking for pilots with radial engine tail wheel time to join the team. And they couldn't find anybody, but they wanted you to pay for it. And it cost me $5,000 to get endorsed on this thing. And there's Tony Moy from Airlines of South Australia. He did my endorsement. It took me 5 hours to master that thing. It wasn't that difficult to fly. It was different. You had to lead with rudder and balance with aileron to go around corners, so it was quite odd. Very noisy. And if you got any slip or skid, smoke and oil came in through the open windows. The windows were open on the side, so it really tightened your flying up. When I did my actual endorsement flight with the CASA examiner, I made sure the ailerons were dead center, and I tied one of Melissa's hair ribbons around this. And he says, what's this? And I said, it's the only way I know whether the bloody wings are level. And he thought that was quite a good idea. I don't know what Kingston Smith did, but it's a highly modified cockpit. It's got, you can just see the word hyper down here. This is all off Navajos. Then it got broken, of course, and that was the end of that flying career. There's another picture of the 7-2. Little Ricky Hull was one of my favourite co-pilots. We had a lot of fun with Rick. We were seconded to East West. and we flew their 727, which is one of ours, Ansett. Rick's now the boss of the A320 with Jetstar. I saw him recently in the simulator centre. He's very serious, wearing a suit. I said, come on, Rick, what's all this bullshit? I then managed to get a slot on the 7-4, and poor old Ansett introduced the airplane like that. They had a number 1 engine out, and the hydraulics, each engine has its own hydraulic system. Number 1 is the nose gear. And they were a bit hot and high, and the gear was coming out using the alternate system, but it was just a bit too slow. And the TAA pilot warned them, ATC warned them, they jammed each other out, the very low cloud base, and they landed with the nose up, and all hell broke loose. Skytech, the checkerboard, no big deal once you're taught how to do it. It looked hairy. In fact, it looked hairier from the jump seat than actually flying it, because when you were flying it, you were concentrating so much on the checkerboard and then following the strobes accurately, you weren't looking at the Chinese ladies hanging out the washing 3 stories above you. And this is Ansett's Olympic airplane, and they put that fancy writing on it. The jumbo doors are labelled L1, L2, L3, L4, L5. L5 is where they service the rear toilets. They service all the catering in the rear galley. And with that trendy 2 and L5 open, it said Sydney Zoo. And Qantas gave us buggery at flight planning. And that's why you shouldn't let marketing people anywhere near airplanes. That's Les and me. You can see the size of the undercarriage on the jumbo. Les was the unfortunate FO on the nose gear thing. The captain at one stage had a red light, and he said, have we got all greens? Les thought he said 4 greens, and Les had 4 greens. He needed 5. So it was a combination of, you know, the usual Swiss cheese. This is the old analog cockpit. When you look at a classic jumbo now, it's like the boiler room of the Titanic. And then, of course, Ansett collapsed. That's the engineer's panel, the overhead panel. That's us being silly. Then I went to Singapore Airlines. And I flew Singapore Airlines until my retirement. We'll just flick through there. That's S.Y. Chow, the big boss. Lovely guy. He's got a prawn farm at Iluka now. He's retired. That's the last of the classic crews when they got rid of the classic and we went on to the 400. That's the 400. Beautiful airplane. Very easy to fly. The easiest airplane I've ever flown to land. You could close your eyes and land that thing. You can see I've got them wide open there. Just some of my aerial shots. The cargo. At one stage we flew 1 month cargo, 1 month passenger, and then they dropped a B scale on the cargo, and you could stay cargo to 65 or go passenger retirement 62. For the extra 3 years on the cargo, it was worth 1 year pay on the passenger. That's the difference in pay. I'd had enough at that stage. I just wanted to come home. That's me, the senior first officer and a second officer, and that's how we flew a lot of the time. More than 12 hours, we had 2 captains. That's the cockpit. That's JFK. Did a lot of flying in there. 3-1 left to the top runway. 3-1 right to the top runway. 3-1 left to the bottom one on the right here. That was the famous Kananzi approach, where you followed a series of strobe lights, similar to Kai-Tak. Some of the weather, lightning. That was -26 when I took that photo. And the FO said, boiling water won't touch the ground. And I said, bullshit. He said, $20. So I gave him $20, expecting to get it back. We bought a jug of boiling water, poured it off the top of the step there, and not a drop hit the ground. It went off like a kid's sparkler. And I thought, wow. So that's Aussies for you. We don't understand cold weather. That's another one of the cockpit. That's a movie, but I won't show it. Oh, it's just a picture of me landing, and it's not a beautiful landing either. So this is my retirement flight, fleet manager and the HR guy in the blue shirt. They cut your tie. We're drinking champagne, by the way. By the time I got here, I'd had a few. They cut your tie off. And Tam was my last FO with Singapore Airlines, so we just call him Tam the man. Tam was his surname, but the Chinese introduced themselves with their surname first. So we used to call him Tam the man, lovely bloke. Then I went to Toll. I couldn't retire at 62, so I flew with Toll until I was 70. Went in as an FO because it's all unionised and direct line seniority. And they said to me, with your background, 3 to 6 months, we'll have you back in the left-hand seat. Well, you know, if somebody says that to you in aviation, you multiply it by 4, and it worked out pretty right. After 2 years, I was back in the left-hand seat. That's Port Moresby. Port Moresby. We went out to Manus Island every Wednesday, second Wednesday. That's Manus Island for the refugee camp. We took all the supplies out there. That's me at Manus, Cocos Island, Nauru, Manus, Port Moresby. There's Cocos. And here's the strip here. It's quite a good strip, actually. And we did charters all through the Pacific, and the night runs all the capital cities in Australia. 2 reds, 2 whites. Pretty good. Pretty good. Taking a photo at the same time. I went across to Parcelair on secondment as well when I was at Airwork, and they own half the company anyway. And I flew the 73s with Parcelair, and that is just that's Palmerston North, and that is such a Kiwi winter picture, that. And then I became a full flight simulator instructor with them when I turned 70. I didn't want to fly past 70. And that gives you an idea of the size of the sims of the guy cleaning down there. That's inside the sim, the classic sim. And I've just given that away because they've sold the simulator, and I'm now back flying GA again. And I'm currently doing IFR training. I'm flying this airplane every day next week on IFR training for a guy. And that's it. But the whole reason for that book was the young fella back here. Don't ever give up, because so many of my friends did. You've got to go where nobody else wants to go, and be on poor wages and just put up with it, because it's the pathway to a good job. You've got to get the experience, unfortunately, and you've got to survive it too. Don't do anything silly in your airplane. No. If you read my book, I did a couple of silly things and nearly killed myself. And that's what I say on the jacket. It's not only a financial risk. When you're in GA in the bush, it's a physical risk. You can get your bum stoved in. And I lost 10 friends. They're all in the front of my book in memoriam. And I've got many more people I know that have been killed in light airplanes, but these were 10 good friends. I went to 2 of the weddings. So don't push airplanes. If you're not, my father gave me advice. He was a wartime pilot, and he said, anytime you're sitting in an airplane cockpit and you feel uncomfortable, do something that makes you feel comfortable. And that saved me about 3 times. I diverted once to Hobart. We had 2 goes into Lawney, and the FO said, "Oh, we'll get in next time." I said, "No, I don't feel comfortable. We're going to Hobart." So that'll keep you alive. That bit of advice from my old man. And with light airplanes, be the last to close all doors, all lockers. Don't let anybody close anything. Be the last to check the oil. Be the last to put the fuel cap on. Don't let anybody else do it. And don't fly in cloud till you've got an instrument rating. And don't bust minimas. And you should make 75. So you're still going to be on your toes, even at 75. Anyway, thanks for listening.
Thank you, George.
If anybody wants a book, they are available on the, the usual thing on the internet. If you just Google Pilot by George Palmer, Surviving a Career in Aviation, you'll get about 14 sites. And when you read the book, Zach, I apologise for saying I don't like helicopters. Zach was one of my students I sent solo, and he's now a helicopter pilot, but I don't blame him for that.
Okay, anybody got any questions? I'll come around with this so that you can, Warwick, you can be first.
This is not a check captain question, is it?
No, just a joke. I think 1 or 2 of those Toll 737-300s had been ones that I'd flown in TAA Australian Airlines. Those some were converted later to freighters. I think you've flown some of mine.
TJK?
Yeah.
TJH, I think it was. They were, JTQ used to be TJQ. And the Kiwis reversed the rego. And I took that to Dothan in Alabama to be converted into a freighter for Toll. And it was a Qantas airplane. So I've flown a Qantas airplane. And I did my 7.4 training with Qantas. I did my 7.3 reval with Qantas when I came back from Singapore Airlines. So I've done quite a bit of training with Qantas. They're very good, actually. They're very good. But yeah, when I would have been taxiing out behind those in a 7.2, and if somebody said one day you'll be flying that, you just don't know in this business. But it's a hard old business.
In TAA, I flew one of the Ansett 727s.
Oh, did you?
We leased it for a while. We had a short
Which one was that?
Zulu, Romeo Mike Zulu.
Oh yeah, I never flew that.
And we were so
That
used to
was
saying Tango Juliet, this and that. And it'd say Tango Juliet, Romeo Mike Zulu.
yeah. No, I didn't fly Zulu. I flew ANA, A, B, Alpha, Bravo, Echo, Foxtrot, and we had a couple of 200s, RMN and RM, not RMS, that was a 100, wasn't it? I can't remember. I have to look at my logbook. I flew about 7 of them.
Thanks, George. That was a really interesting talk. You've had a very good career. One of the questions that comes up a lot with older pilots like us is we think back to what the life was like in airlines when we were there and know how different it is now. So when young people come up to you and they say, I'm thinking of taking up aviation, we really wondered whether we should say to them, yes, it's a good idea.
I know. This is the problem I've got because Cathay Pacific are experimenting with single pilot in cruise. They're talking of artificial intelligence replacing pilots. But I don't know if you've read that QF32 book where it blew a hole in the wing and the fuel's pouring out the top of the wing. And with the A320, it's starting to, with all the computers, it can pick up a fuel imbalance. And so what is it going to do? Is it going to transfer good fuel to the hole? Where a human being, one of the flight attendants looks out the window and sees the fuel coming out of the hole. So she goes to the cockpit and says, you've got fuel coming out of a hole on top of the wing. I can't see how artificial intelligence can replace that human element. If we do go that way, and I think we're going that way, Ray, I think this young fella here, if you get a command in the airlines, you'll probably be the last of the stick and rudder captains. You may have very quiet overnights. You might have a robot sitting beside you. Well, when we got rid of the flight engineer, it cut my bar bill by a third, so that was a good move. But the thought of flying single pilot in a jet, long haul, and fatigue is the big elephant in the room. I didn't realise how tired I was doing 15 years of long haul until I stopped doing it. And I used to walk around all the time with these sort of crushing ribs and bags under my eyes, and literally you can't talk. We used to be in cabs, especially in London, because the London cabbies are very London cabby, and they'd be saying, "Oh, why are you going there, love?" And you just couldn't talk. You were so tired you couldn't talk. I used to get about 2 hours sleep. We used to leave Singapore pretty close to midnight for all the Europe flights. Doesn't matter whether you're going to Zurich, Munich, Madrid, London, Manchester, Paris, Rome. We all leave around midnight. So you're out of rhythm already, and then you do 14, 12 hours. You might get a couple of hours in the bunk. And by the time you're in the cab going into the hotel, I once woke up in full uniform in bed. I just forgot to take my clothes off. That's how tired I was. So I really don't know how artificial intelligence is going to be a good co-pilot. I just can't see it. I didn't fly the 787 or any of the really up-to-date 350 787, but there were some things on the 400 jumbo that I thought were detrimental to the classic jumbo. The classic jumbo in some ways was nicer to fly. What you saw is what you got. There was no sort of mystery. Where once you get into these electronic airplanes with their EFIS or ECAM, as Airbus call it, they can be quite difficult to manage when you've got a fault. You've got to be very careful with checklists. You've got to be very careful you don't go down the wrong rabbit hole. Where in the old Bristol, if the Bristol did anything, first of all, it would tell you with a loud boom, and then you look out the window and there'd be oil going everywhere. And the only checklist is get your bum on the ground, Where it's totally different now. I've noticed also we get a lot of airline guys wanting to do BFRs where I'm working at the moment. And the Airbus guys in particular literally forget how to fly. They pick it up quickly enough, but they don't trim. In the simulator, if you're doing a Boeing course for an Airbus guy, you cannot, for the love of God, to get them to move the heading bug because the Airbus moves it for you. But don't get me wrong, the Airbuses are beautiful airplanes. They're so far advanced compared to the 737. The 737 is a tractor. The Airbuses are beautiful airplanes. I nearly flew the 330. What saved me was the 2-year delay when the Germans and the French built the fuselage halves on the jumbo, when they went to, on the 380, sorry, when they went to glue them together, whatever they do in Toulouse, the looms didn't, the wiring harnesses didn't match. The Germans have been using a different computer program to the French. The head of EADS got the sack. There was a 2-year delay, and S.Y. Chow came in on my course and said, well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to take you off. You could stay on the jumbo. And I tried very hard because I was struggling a bit with the theory on the Airbus. They're quite complex airplanes.
Well, they had to rewire them and leave the old wiring in, and Singapore bought them because they were cheap.
We actually had to
And that's why
sign a
they
form to say
retired.
we weren't
They were
allowed
the
to
first
talk
ones
about
to
it, to be
retire.
honest. But they bought 4 very cheap, but they were a lot heavier than the subsequent production
Well,
airplanes.
that was the wiring.
Yeah, and I believe they've all since been scrapped too. Yeah. But I sat in on the jump seat on the A380, and it took the guys an hour to set the cockpit up. Well, we could turn around the Boeing in 10 minutes, really. If you knew what you're doing, you could turn it around in 10 minutes. We didn't. But I often sit in the back of an Airbus and have this fear that both pilots are food poisoning. Is there a pilot on board? You know,
Well, talking about AI, remember the autopilot in Flying High?
oh yes, yes. No, in your dreams, Bob. In your dreams. It was. That was a joke I had to put up with a lot. We had 3 autopilots on the jumbo, and their co-pilots used to come in and say, "Oh, I got 4 Georges today," and I said, "I've heard that. Heard that one. I've heard that one." Yeah. Yeah, I got that a bit. I'm talking light aircraft here for the young fella, because in the airlines, you've got no control over it. You know, I used to hate signing the load sheet. I once took tractors to Oman on the freighter. And when you get to Oman, I don't know if you've ever been there, there's not a blade of glass anywhere. And I thought, well, they're doing the tractors here. But apparently they were putting on the barges, breaking the embargo with Iran and sending them across to Iran. Now, you know, you're the captain in charge of the vessel. In a court case, it could come back to you. But we used to sign these forms that I am satisfied this aircraft's been loaded in accordance with. Well, Ray will tell you, you have no idea what's underneath it. And we used to carry small arms ammunition, all sorts of stuff. And you've got no control in the heavy world. Everybody else is closing hatches and things. The engineers are dispatching you. I once landed a 727 and the plug-in for the DC power, the cover was missing. And it turned out that when the engineer pulled his plug out, he hadn't closed it properly and the slipstream just ripped it off. And of course, you've got no control. But in a light airplane, you've got all control. You know, a friend of mine had a Cessna 402 nose locker door come open. A passenger closed it for him. And a bag came out, went through the prop. You know, you just don't. Sorry, I'm being father now. You do it all yourself. Now, that's what I meant by that, because in the bigger airplane world, it's a different world. We nearly lost to Bristol down at King Island, because I don't know if you ever heard of a mineral called scheelite. I think it's scheelite. It sounds like somebody with a tea towel on his head, but it's heavier than lead, and they mine it on King Island. And 4 ton of scheelite only came up that high on the floor in the Bristol. Now, in the morning, they were removing a whole pile of furniture for somebody there. And in the afternoon, they were picking up the scheelite. Well, the furniture guy, or the scheelite guy came first. And the furniture guy turned up and thought the airplane was empty. Just put all his furniture on top. So they had 8 ton in the airplane instead of 4 ton in the airplane. But the pilots doing the walk around said, the tire's bloody flat. And they went around the other side. That one's flat too. And they said, well, that doesn't happen. So they knew there was something wrong with the load. And that's when they picked it up. And there's been a lot of theories about it over the years. I've spoken to a couple of guys I used to work with there, and they said they probably would have got the tail up, but it wouldn't have flown. And if you know the King Island runways, quarries and trees and rocks, and probably would have killed them. So, you know, there's always gremlins in aviation. I just did my IPC the other day, and one of the comments made was, you're starting to slow down. Well, I am, but it's probably mentally as well. You know, I passed okay. He said, your IR flying is great, but it's nothing with that. He says, you're definitely showing signs of slowing down. But I slow down with light airplanes because I can see the risk now. Don't ever rush a light airplane. I've seen an air commander revving its little heart out. And I thought, what's going on here? Look out, and it's towing one of the tie down blocks behind it. Oh, you know. Great future that bloke's got.
Was a recent one.
Sooner or later, something will get him.
There was a recent one in the US where the guy left the tow bar on the nose of the
Oh, I
aircraft.
saw that. Yeah, that was a Pilatus, wasn't it, or something?
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a wonderful career. Don't give up. But it's going to be tough. Yeah, and I ended up interviewing pilots for airwork in my last few weeks there. I ended up with a managerial title. And what fascinated me was all you young blokes when I said, have you got any questions? Because, you know, the HR lady's going flat out, tell me a time when you diffused a conflict in the cockpit and all this nonsense that they go on with. And at the end of it all, the chief pilot said, is there anything you want to ask George? And I said, no. And I said to the candidates, is there anything you want to ask? And they all said, how long to command? And I just blew me out of the water. You know, just be a good co-pilot first. The airplane can't leave without you. And you've got to do the yards. You've just got to take your turn. Don't ever say that to a crusty old airline captain because it'll wrap him off.
Well, George, I might see if there's anybody got any questions from.
Is there people out there? Is there
in the land out there? Anybody on?
Do I know anybody out
got
there?
A question?
I'll just read one of the comments there from Maxine Godley, who you can see at the top
Yep.
left. She says, I flew from 1964 to 1970 with Ansett as a hostie.
Oh,
Love seeing some old aircraft friends. Great presentation, Captain George.
thank you.
Thanks.
Did we fly together? You weren't the one giving me cold coffee, were you? That's what someone said to me the other day. In your airline career, have you ever been, you know, lay people always say, what's the worst thing that's ever happened to you in your airline career? And I find that a bit irritating now. So I just said cold coffee. Just kept walking. Training is designed to make flying boring. But a lot of people ask, what do you do in cruise? Just sitting there with the autopilot. And the book explains that because that's another thing that annoys me. We're very busy, especially going through India, Pakistan, sensitive borders, Afghanistan with the mountains. You got to look at decompression, escape routes. And then you're looking all the time at fuel, weather. You've got, when you're going long haul, you get, even though you've got fuel heaters, you get fuel icing. And with fuel icing, you've got to either go down to get into warmer air or go faster. Each 0.01 Mach number is 1 degree. So I ended up going 8.8 once in the jumbo because I couldn't get down because everybody underneath me is blocking me and I've got cold fuel. And people come into the cockpit and think you're just sitting there doing nothing. You're always doing something. If you're not doing anything in a jet, you've missed something. Well, you go Melbourne to Sydney. I know guys used to do the crossword puzzle, but they used to miss things. Yeah.
I was in a friendship out of Sydney one day, and we got it. I was in the jump seat, and we got airborne, and the captain pushed his seat back, put the autopilot on, and opened the newspaper across the panel.
The Fokker Friendship autopilot was called an AL30J. I remember it. It's one of those things. I can't remember my anniversary the other day. I got into trouble for that, but I can remember the Fokker Friendship autopilot was an AL30J, and we used to call it the hijack box. It would just sit there, and then just suddenly off it would go. Yeah, so anybody that did that with a newspaper was crazy.
All right, George. Well, thank you very much
No,
for
it's a pleasure.
a most entertaining evening.
go, everyone. Thank you very much.